Hello, welcome back to the final part of today's lecture. In the final section, I want to look at Kate Pullinger's novel Weird Sister and also Anne Sexton's poem The Witch's Life. And I want to think about the ways they rewrite witches specifically, so building on the discussion of Condé and Atwood so far, and looking back to the first section of the module about Benson and about Knox and their understandings of what witchcraft and magic in fiction can do. So when we look at Sexton's poem, it's very different again to the text that we've looked at so far. It's much shorter, apart from anything else. This is a very short meditation. But also it appears almost entirely without magic. So is it magical realist? No, maybe it's not. Is it writing back? Yeah, possibly in some ways, maybe not so much in other ways. Is it postmodernist? Yes, surely in some ways, but perhaps not in others, and so on and so forth. You can have this discussion with yourself and with each other in the module discussion forum. So look at The Witch's Life from 1975. There doesn't seem to be any magic in it. Sexton is really using the witch as a metaphor here. And this is one of the things that we've thought about repeatedly over the last few weeks, and we'll continue to think about in the course of the module. The witch becoming a kind of metaphor for a certain kind of identity politics, for example. The exploration of the possibilities opening up to women in the 20th century, an exploration of issues of race and liberty and so on. The witch is a metaphor here then, and Sexton seems to, or the speaker, if it is Sexton, seems to identify with her and think of herself as a witch in a variety of different ways. And perhaps some of that is based on stereotypes or archetypes of witches. So the woman in the poem seems to be ageing, she seems to be isolated, she has a problematic relationship with the children in her neighbourhood. Perhaps she has familiars. There is something haunting her, there is something haunting the speaker and the woman who she describes as a witch in her poem. The text is very evasive and suggestive, and that's common to all of the texts this week, I think, which makes me think it does fall into a similar kind of category here. And it's very ambiguous. You know, what happens at the end? We're not sure. The poem seems to peter out. It stops, perhaps in a rather similar way to Half-Hanged Mary, which kind of goes off into what? Into silence, into nothingness, into empowerment? Where does it end? So think about the witch's life in those ways, and I think this will also be useful looking ahead to the coming weeks when we think about what witches are a metaphor for. If we look at Kate Pullinger's novel Weird Sister alongside of the witch's life, we can see again that there are certain similarities. But one of the things that Pullinger does is tell the story in the form of a writing back. So Agnes re-enters the text, which might once have been about her life, and we see at the beginning of the novel that Pullinger quotes from the original news pamphlet, which was about the historical Agnes Samuel and her parents being hanged in 1593 in War Boys. So she quotes that, and then she leaves us to imagine how Agnes has reinserted her voice into that narrative, and how indeed she appears to have returned to punish the people who are responsible for her death. So Pullinger takes that idea further and she makes it expand in a variety of ways. Yet nevertheless, the idea of witchcraft seems to stand in for a variety of other issues. It is metaphorical. We're talking about issues of gender here. We're talking about issues of identity and nationality and insiders and outsiders and belonging and not belonging and conforming and not conforming and so on. So it seems to fall into those sort of categories as well. This is what Kate Pullinger said about Weird Sister when I asked her, this is an interview I did with her several years ago, and I asked her about what her inspirations were. And they're very diverse, and I think that's fascinating. There's a sort of postmodern sense that she's gathering eclectically sources of all different kinds and throwing them together into this novel to see what comes out. But it's also interesting that she picks on a couple of earlier magical realist texts. So she says her inspirations were the sensational novels from the 19th century, in particular the fabulous Mary Elizabeth Braddon and Lady Audley's Secret. Yes, it is fabulous, you should read it. Witchcraft cases from England in the 16th century, yes. Reading around fairy tales, Marina Warner, of course, and Jack Zipes. So they're both critics who've written about fairy tales, and particularly, in Warner's case, about magical realism. Zipes writes about folk tales. And so again, we're trespassing on that territory that Baldic said was very much related to the creation of magical realism. And of course Salem, so relevant to a lot of the other texts that we're looking at the moment on the module. Hussein's The Virago Book of Witches. Summers, Montague Summers' book, The History of Witchcraft. Rosen's Witchcraft in England 1558 to 1618, which is a collection of news pamphlets about witchcraft, which has the Warboys pamphlet in it, though I first found the pamphlet in the British Library on its own, she says. The Witch in History by Diane Purkis. That's something that's very familiar to all of us now, isn't it? I hope you've either had a look at it by now or you're planning to do so. But really interesting to see a critical work, a historical work referenced here. So a work about literary criticism, a work of literary criticism, then is woven into the creation of further literature. That's very duplicative and metafictional, isn't it? Lolly Willows. There's the text from the 20s, the one I talked about earlier by Sylvia Townsend Warner from 1926. And Pullinger says this was one of her inspirations. So that early form of magical realism has got into Weird Sister. The Crucible, yes, again, we have that Salem reference in the Alice Hoffman novel. So things like Practical Magic, which you may have come across as a film based on that novel as well. John Updike, author of The Witches of Eastwick. Stephen King, the horror writer. There's all sorts going on in this text, isn't there? Obviously, writers often have a wide range of inspirations, but this does appear particularly packed. And the way that it circles around different genres and it looks at different kinds of writing about witches is, I think, really interesting. It has a sort of postmodernist feel. Clearly she's interested in magical realism, and what emerges is a writing back fiction in a lot of ways. Why does Pullinger do this? She's not known for her writing about the supernatural, though she had written a novel about vampires as well. But if you look at the next slide, you can see some of the experimental and digital fictions that she's worked on. What Pullinger's interested in is genre. She's interested in generic innovation. And one of the ways that she's done this is to write novels which come in the form of video games, essentially, or in the form of video puzzles, or are co-authored to the extent that they've really lost touch with the idea of any individual author and are written by multiple people. So, for example, she created a story called Inanimate Alice, which is still ongoing. You still get episodes of Inanimate Alice every now and again, about this girl who travels worldwide experiencing adventures. And they are puzzle narratives. So from about the third one onwards, you get a little puzzle to do as you walk through the screen, which tells you different parts of the story. So, for example, in I think the third chapter, if you like, of Inanimate Alice, you have to find in each scene the Russian doll, and you have to put the Russian doll into a little box at the bottom of the screen. And it's partly educational, so the games / novels / stories start off very simple. They're for younger people to learn about how to develop their motor skills, if you like, and develop their storytelling skills and develop their vocabulary. So they're almost like children's stories. They start off in the genre of children's stories or video games. And then, like the Harry Potter stories, they grow up with the reader. And by the end, you've got really quite complex stories where people are learning about coding, and they're learning about different kinds of cultures and different religions and different opportunities to tell stories, different genres, through the course of reading these Inanimate Alice stories. So they're very interactive. I mean, they appear quite crude, the early ones now. Obviously, the technology has come on quite a bit since Pullinger started doing this. But they are interactive right from the start, and they make you think about the ways in which the reader is involved in a story. What do we bring to it? How far do we push the plot along? You know, if there's a moment where we decide to click on something, do we also do that process when we're reading a novel, when we're turning over a page, for example? Or we're deciding to think a bit more about some character in the story or some issue in the story. It makes you think about how you structure your reading inside your own head, even when you're reading a very traditional form like a bound book. What decisions are you making? A digital fiction can help you think about the reader's role in a story. So there are other examples of this. Flight Path, for example, is the other one that I've given here, which is a similar kind of fiction. And also Pullinger's co-created a number of fictions which are kind of crowdsourced. So she writes a sort of crowdsourced fiction, like Letter to an Unknown Soldier, which has a staggering 22,000 participants who all wrote a letter to an unknown World War One soldier, such as the one commemorated on the cenotaph in Whitehall, although this was another one. It makes you think about exactly what an author is. Who has the right to tell stories? How do they have to tell them? Do they have to write a realist novel? No, probably not. Maybe they can do something else. What about the epistolary form? What about the letter as a form of creative writing? Feminist scholars have argued, for example, that women's letters from the past are an important form of creative writing and are worthy of scholarly and literary critical attention in very much the same way as a novel by, say, an 18th century male novelist. Breathe is the most recent fiction of hers that I've looked at, which is a story that tells itself to you on your phone. And again, it's kind of crude in a number of ways. It relies on the data that you've put into the phone. So if you're a bit cagey with your data, it won't be as good in the telling as maybe it could be. But it makes you think about the way that the phone's camera is used and what data it can gather about the weather, the light conditions, the room that you're in. And the location software, how does that work? Does it matter that the phone knows where you are? How creepy is that? Is that like a ghost story? She suggests it actually is like a ghost story, and she tells you a ghost story over your phone to get you to think about those issues. And I think Weird Sister is an early example of that. I'm not sure Pullinger knew where she was going at the time, but she knew what she was interested in. And these ultimately issued in those digital fictions that she subsequently wrote. So I think Weird Sister is interesting as magical realism, as postmodernism, and as writing back. But it's also interested in genre and the ways in which genre interacts with those different literary terms. The kind of concerns that Pullinger has are classics of those three literary terms. So she's interested in, the next slide, decentering the author. She's interested in reader-created episodes, so there's a link to stuff like fan fiction there. She's interested in interactive and choice-driven fictions. She's interested in multimedia fictions. All the sort of boundaries that we associate with literature today collapse around this understanding of what a story is. She's interested in challenging conventional narrative space. She's interested in journeys and identities. And I think you can see all of those things in Weird Sister, really. So I want to leave you with the idea of a story which is about witches, maybe as a ghost story as well, and which appears to be a fairly classic sort of novel, a fairly classic text, perhaps magical realist, but, essentially just another novel, really. Probably a popular novel, perhaps in the chick lit genre, and I'm going to get you to think about the cover in a minute. It just looks like an ordinary story, and it really isn't. It actually does some really interesting generic innovations, some formal innovations in its course. And I want to leave you thinking about that, because I want you to think, and this is something to think about in coming weeks as well, about how telling a magical story facilitates experimentation of that kind. How far does including magic in a story automatically challenge boundaries and make identity shape shift and make us aware of new possibilities for us as readers or as individuals or for the characters in the story? I think this has been something that magical realism has continually done. I think it's something that postmodernism is very interested in, and certainly writing back is precisely the sort of genre that aims to facilitate that empowerment. So how far does including magic automatically do that? Can you tell a magical story which doesn't do any of those things? What does magic bring to fiction, in other words? And if you look at the final slide, I want to get you to think about those covers that I showed you at the beginning. So there's a cover image of Weird Sister and there's a cover image of Ita Tuber at the start of this lecture on the title slide. But there are other versions as well. There are other editions, and please have a look at those online. And I'd like you to think in each case about how the book is packaged. It's a marketable artefact. It's something that we can buy off the shelf, or we can acquire second-hand from the internet, or we can download as an e-book. But it's also a way of publishers marketing to us what the content of the book is and selling that to us, so it's meant to be appealing. But it's also kind of a way of smuggling stuff in, it seems to me. Sometimes writers are annoyed about the covers of their book. They think that it makes them look too safe, too boring, too very much like all the other stories in that genre, when actually they're not in that genre at all. And I think you might see both of those things going on in the covers of these novels. Think about how the story is sold to you. Think about how you consume it. Think about how the publisher has packaged it for you, and whether that really does justice to its experimental nature and its potentially quite political and revolutionary themes. And also please find another example of a novel about witchcraft and magic and post that cover in the module discussion forum. I want you to start thinking about visual culture again this week, and we're moving back in that direction in the coming weeks with things like the Harry Potter films and the film and TV that we're going to be looking at in the final week of the module, and Dahl's film The Witches and so on. But just think about the ways in which visual images interact with some of the issues that I've covered in this lecture. Think about the ambiguities inherent in them and have a chat on the module discussion forum to see where you think each of these texts fits on the spectrum around the three literary critical ideas that I've been discussing. And I'll hope to see you soon.